Hello and welcome to the Clear Crypto podcast, brought to you by Starkware and Cointelegraph. No jargon, no hype, just straight talk on what crypto and blockchain do today and what they're going to do tomorrow. If clear and crypto sound like a contradiction in terms, you're in the right place. Maybe you're just stepping into this world. We will get you up to speed. And if you're an OG who lives and breathes this stuff, stick around, because communicating about blockchain is one of the biggest challenges we have today, and you will be better at it for these conversations. I'm Nathan, a journalist who's fallen into blockchain. I head up media at Starkware. And in the last episode, we looked at tokenization and how it enables real-world assets to exist on blockchain. Today, we have a bit of a change of tempo. We're going to be talking to a visionary who is at the center of efforts to get the powers that be listening to why blockchain and crypto are important. I promise you're in for an interesting conversation. Okay, let's get down to our guest today, somebody who has been defending and explaining crypto and blockchain for years, Peter Van Valkenburgh. He is the executive director at Coin Center. I'm going to let Peter tell you exactly what Coin Center does. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for having me. So you flatter me with visionary. No, so my main job is Coin Center. Coin Center is a nonprofit that's based in Washington, D.C., and we have been around for a long time in crypto years. We were founded in 2014, back when really the only crypto that someone in Congress or in the administrative agencies in Washington would know about or even ask questions about was just Bitcoin. It was before Ethereum had launched, before a lot of the new projects in the space that we're seeing do such interesting work. And back then, lawmakers had tons of questions, and there's no corporation you can call up that is Bitcoin that can explain the good answers to you that are hopefully unbiased and unvarnished and would give them a good idea of how best to regulate the space and how to avoid crushing the innovation in the space. So Coin Center was stood up back then for the purpose of being a trusted voice to explain this to members of Congress who are thinking about making laws. I was the original director of research there, so I would write the legal analysis and the papers looking at how existing laws that regulate financial institutions intersect or don't intersect with some of the new businesses and technologies that have come out of cryptocurrency. Since then, things have changed a lot. I mean, obviously, especially within U.S. policy, you see a lot of interest in crypto from regulators, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. You see a lot of interest in crypto now, even all the way up to the presidency, with Trump making a lot of statements about crypto, fundraising using crypto, these sorts of things. And so,
yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, Peter, because the way I imagined it is that, you came into this world and you were trying to get people within government and elsewhere to pay attention and to actually be interested in crypto. And now, as I imagine it, you have, especially since the election of Trump and a more crypto-friendly administration, do you have people knocking on your door saying, help us answer our questions, help us to understand this world?
I mean, absolutely. Crypto's success and its popularity now is sort of a double-edged sword, though, because now a lot of people, their first exposure to it will be something else and not necessarily, a briefing from a nonprofit like Coin Center. It might be that they watched a campaign ad from Elizabeth Warren. It might be that they saw a write-up in the New York Times about President Trump's family's dealings in meme coins, and they got the idea that that's all this technology is about. And they maybe they don't like President Trump, and maybe therefore they don't like crypto. So it's interesting to be at a time where we face less profound regulatory threats because, agencies like the Securities Exchange Commission, which regulates securities trading, have taken a step back from really aggressively policing, especially good faith actors in the space who are trying to comply with ambiguous laws. But simultaneously, you've got maybe more partisan discussions, more boosters for the tech that are sometimes maybe foolishly boosting things that they shouldn't be boosting, and more detractors from the tech who think that it's nothing but scams and corruption and therefore needs to be outlawed. So the stakes have just gotten higher in DC, not necessarily uniformly better. Coin Center's mission is to defend people's rights to publish the underlying software and operate the underlying trust minimized networks. And what that means is, like, if there's something that makes crypto different from corporations doing your finance for you, big banks, big financial institutions, it's that there should be this public good nature of the network where anyone using freely available software on the internet can hold their own money and send money to a friend overseas without trusting an intermediary. And so our mission is to defend the people who publish that software and make that public good available to the larger population, hopefully for good, for privacy, for civil liberties purposes. And so our mission's quite narrow. We're not here to tell government that, they should encourage people to use the tech. We're here simply to say, you should regulate people who are trusted in this space because we don't like seeing FTXs collapse and people losing their money. But you should also not overregulate people who are just developing the technology and allowing people to make peer-to-peer transactions, which does revolutionize our capabilities as far as financial dealings.
That's important. Now, you're located in Washington, D.C. Your main emphasis is on American policy. We have listeners who are all over the world, and it's really important to hammer home the point that what goes on in Washington, what goes on in America is important to all of us because governments all over the world are actually watching what's happening in the US. Is that something you would agree with? Give us a bit of context there.
Yeah, I mean, over our 10 years of operating, we've certainly had a fair share of folks from Europe and East Asia and other places ask, like, hey, could you guys do more work over here? There needs to be more of an independent voice for the tech that isn't a corporation or a government that's trying to ban corporations from dealing in the tech. And we've said, sure, we would love to, but our expertise is American law and policy. And to your point, Nathan, American law and policy, for better and sometimes for worse, does often echo across the globe, either because other nations implement our policies or because multinational organizations, NGOs, multilateral treaties basically export U.S. policy abroad. This has happened especially in the crypto space in the context of anti-money laundering policy. When the U.S. Treasury says, you need to collect all this information about your customers to stop money laundering, it will often also go to an international organization like the OECD or the Financial Action Task Force, which meets in Paris every year, and say, every other country needs to collect all this private information about people who are transacting as well. And of course, there's some good about collecting information about people who are transacting. Hopefully we can stop crime and money laundering, but it can be taken too far and become a tool for totalitarian surveillance and control, where if you make the wrong purchases, if you read the wrong books and it shows up in your bank records, you end up on a watch list or worse, in a re-education camp.
Peter, I think you're the antithesis of what people imagine when we say a crypto man. People think of coders in basements or traders in bedsits, and generally an antisocial kind of stereotype. But recently, the talk that you referred to before, I listened to you speaking on stage. It was basically a love letter to communities and to human interactions, and you framed it all in terms of your hatred of cars. I'm going to ask you to connect this in a minute to blockchain, but first of all, let me give you a minute or two for your rant. Go on.
Yeah. I mean, I don't hate cars. I think cars are incredibly valuable and useful. I hate that in large parts of America, you can't really get around anywhere without one. And so walkable communities and places where people can bike and see each other as they move through a neighborhood rather than just rush through a neighborhood, creating traffic, that matters a lot to me. And it's something I advocate for personally. But yeah, so like biking matters a lot to me. And just being part of a neighborhood rather than being an isolated node that just, you put the kid in this SUV, the kid doesn't even see out the window because the car seat's too low. And then they just magically appear at their destination, which is another sanitized, perfect environment for them. It solves some problems as far as child safety, but I think it creates some problems as far as child development and ultimately potentially sort of antisocial culture. So for me, it all comes down to peer-to-peer interaction, right? You should be in the room with people. You should be dealing with people directly. You shouldn't be relying on some intermediated system to connect you with somebody else. And it's through those personal interactions that we learn other people's preferences and we learn how to adjust our behavior to conform with those other people's preferences when we think it's worth conforming with and being civil, and to disagree when we don't. And when we do everything through machines in a highly intermediated way where we don't see our counterparties and we don't think about the person on the other side of the transaction, I think we lose a lot of our common humanity, and it leads to a lot of potentially pernicious developments in our culture.
So let's unpack that a little bit for listeners, because some of them may have a bit of intellectual whiplash, as I think is common when speaking, when listening to your mind working so fast, Peter, because we started off in a point where, you like human societies, interactions, what you call peer-to-peer interactions, meaning kind of, person-to-person interactions. And I think the unsuspecting listener would be sitting here going, oh, is this guy going to give a critique of digital culture? Is this guy going to be anti-crypto because, the average crypto person sits at the end of Twitter and if the stereotype is to be believed, doesn't interact with human beings? And then we hear actually you turning the argument on its head and saying, actually, crypto and blockchain are really helpful for that kind of society where we are interacting. So let's slow it down and understand a bit how you get from A to B.
Sure. So a couple things. First, I wouldn't make the too strong claim that crypto is already delivering on all of its promises. And there are a lot of bad projects in the space. There's a lot of scams and a lot of abuse that effectively alienates people by victimizing them. And I don't mean to detract from those problems. But the core idea behind crypto is that we shouldn't have to rely on a large, soulless bureaucracy in the middle when we interact with someone else online. We should be able to return to a world like the world that existed before we did all of our interactions online, where when we talk with somebody, like I'm talking with you right now, Nathan, we're actually just one-on-one. There isn't another party in the room. There isn't a large corporation, which is in this case Riverside.fm, which makes very good podcasting software, but also injects itself in the middle of these conversations effectively. And so is there a way to build technological systems where we don't have to have a bank in between you and me when I want to pay you, where we don't have to have a Google in between me and you if I just want to send a message or have a video chat? Because if there is, then we should be working to build those systems for a couple of reasons. It promotes a sort of peer-to-peer honesty and disintermediated directness as we talk to each other. And it also, and more importantly, removes the vulnerabilities that happen when we do everything through an intermediated way. So when we always rely on banks for all of our transactions, unlike the old world where we would make cash transactions in person, those banks develop an incredible amount of power and knowledge over our behavior. And so they can be used to profile our behavior, to adjust the services they offer to us, or effectively deplatform us if they think that what we're talking about or purchasing is not the good life or what people should be striving for. And that kind of centralized control can be benign in the form of, you just accidentally get kicked off your bank account because you sent a message about a Cuban sandwich, and Cuban sandwiches raised a sanctions flag because in the US, Cuba is a sanctioned country, which is just inconvenient and annoying, or because your identity got stolen and your account got hacked and now you can't open accounts at other banks. These are all sort of like low-grade digital annoyances that come from intermediated financial services or intermediated technological services generally. And then there's also the more dangerous potential future based on that highly intermediated world that we have online, wherein the intermediaries come under the influence of totalitarian powers or are themselves oppressive because of the corporate bottom line, where they say, look, the best example of this would be, Western China, where the purchasing practices of Uyghurs in Western China are analyzed by the financial intermediaries like Alipay and WeChat. And if someone in Western China, who's probably a Uyghur in this case, stops purchasing cigarettes and stops purchasing alcohol, that is noted and then reported to the Chinese Communist Party as indicia of them probably becoming more Muslim and more devout in their practices, effectively avoiding these things that are prescribed in their religion. And then that puts them on a list, and that puts them in line for re-education in a work camp. That's the kind of terrifying cultural totalitarianism that, to me, is what makes me most passionate about this technology. Is we need to avoid that highly technological future where the mountains of data that governments and corporations have on us can be leveraged to oppress us. And crypto, as in peer-to-peer transactions that are facilitated by neutral networks rather than centralized corporations, is our best hope of building a new internet and a new way of interacting online that's more personal and less depersonalizing and ultimately potentially dehumanizing in the case of oppressive regimes' usage of those intermediaries.
It's very thought-provoking and chilling to hear you talking about oppressive regimes. This is also relatable in our everyday lives, not in such a sinister way, but in a very real way. You were talking about intermediary software. Let's give an example and let's see if this works. If I want to wish you a happy birthday, happy 21st to Peter, and do so in the
Far
way
more than
that,
that.
well, maybe, and do so in the way that people normally do this today, then I'm going to write you on one of the social media platforms, dear Peter, happy birthday, probably put in some funny comments about bicycles and other things that you're into. And then moments later, the algorithm of the social media software will ingest all of this information that I'm giving them about you. You're not even giving them about yourself, and monetize that information about you to start sending Peter advertisements for all type of cycling products that you probably don't want. And a stage beyond this is that if I, at a subsequent point, break what the social media platform sees as some of its rules, or the algorithm believes that I've broken some of those rules, then I can be taken off the platform, and I could potentially, if that's my sole way of contacting you, lose contact with you and with other friends. And that's kind of very real, even in everyday life, in very civilized and kind of, enlightened societies, Peter, right? Is that a sense of what you mean?
Yeah, that's an easy and good way, I think, to explain the base problem. And another way to think about it is just in great cycles of technological evolution. So 100 years ago, we had lots of problems as a civilization, but we didn't have these problems, right? There was a common public square. Most of the important things you did in your life, you would do in person. And the roads, the town square, even the wires, you think of like telephone wires, you would just send a series of electrical signals across the wire. The operator might be listening, but even then, they're just one human. They're not a massive technological system that can record and maintain and manipulate all that data and collect it and either monetize it or oppress you using it. And you think about the broadcast and media landscape. People used to listen to the radio and they would just receive signals from other broadcasters. Nowadays, there is no way to participate in large-scale modern society without effectively constantly being an asset on a different platform. You're either a user of Facebook, in which case all of your interactions are modulated through Facebook, or you're a user of a banking service for paying other people. And crypto is important as a sort of safety valve for that otherwise tightly locked down system. In a world where all transactions are now going through banks, even in-person transactions because you're using a credit card, crypto allows me to still pay people electronically without having to go through a potential choke point. And so for me, the value of that being a viable alternative is in itself very important. And I would also like to see in the long run, more of the important things we do online happen through these disintermediated systems. So it's not just a safety valve, it's actually just the way we typically interact online. If I want to wish Nathan a happy birthday, I can just do it directly. I don't need to trust Facebook. I don't need to rely on them to not exploit this message I've sent to Nathan for their own financial gain, or worse, for, nefarious purposes if they're in league with some sort of corrupt state power.
Now, Peter, you're great on the kind of, ideas and the vision. Now, on this show also, we speak to some amazing builders, some amazing developers. And what I would love to hear from you is, when these people come on the show, what are the questions that you would like to hear me asking them in terms of developing the technology that is needed to turn your vision into reality? What are the key things that you would like to see built in order to actualize all of the ideals that you think about every day?
I mean, I think it's two things. One, if you're building in crypto, you're doing something that's more difficult. Like, it'd be much easier. It's much easier to build a Facebook than to build a decentralized crypto-based social network, because Facebook's just a giant computer or data center run by a company that collects all this information and relays it to the people that are talking to each other, or chooses to not, which is why they have so much power. Building a version of a messaging platform, like a public town square where people can talk to each other even if they're not in person, that doesn't involve a big data center that one company controls, is fundamentally more difficult. But it's amazing that it is now possible thanks to these new technologies like blockchains and peer-to-peer transactions. And so the first thing to always ask, I think, is, where have you encountered struggles? Would it have been easier to build a centralized database to just collect and relay this information or mediate these transactions? And have you really run into difficulties and overcome those difficulties to build this in a truly peer-to-peer way? So, like, have you actually avoided recreating the mistakes of the old internet where you've injected yourself as a controlling intermediary in transactions? And then second, even if you don't have control, have you, in the way you've designed your product, honored the privacy expectations of users? And this is a really tough one because even Bitcoin, for your listeners who are newer to this technology, they might have the wrong idea. They might think that Bitcoin is some super private way of paying other people. But the reality of Bitcoin is that when you pay someone else just using a normal Bitcoin transaction, you get their address, you pay their address. You can get their address, their Bitcoin address, and go to the public blockchain. And then you, having no business or legitimate reason to know this information, can look up all of the past transactions to that address. And if you use sophisticated computers and big data systems, which adversarial parties would use, you can create a highly detailed picture of their entire financial history in Bitcoin transactions because those transactions are effectively unencrypted or naked and visible on the public ledger. So Bitcoin's great in that it removed there being a company in the middle who could monetize and abuse your private information. But the way it removed the company was by making all that information just fully public, which is perhaps an improvement because now we don't worry about one person violating your privacy, but you do have to worry about you having no privacy on that network. And there are new crypto technologies that either build on Bitcoin, better wallets for Bitcoin as to how they form transactions and avoid leaving private information or personal information on a blockchain, like mixing transactions, and new cryptocurrencies like Zcash and tools on other things like Tornado Cash and Ethereum that prevent you from accidentally exposing your financial transaction history on the blockchain when you use them. But ordinary people, if you're new to crypto, you're going to say, well, I don't even know what he just said. How would I make sure I'm using crypto in a way that protects my privacy? I just know that there's these networks and maybe I can use this one or that one. How do I know which ones protect my privacy? And so as we move forward, as projects develop like a new social network that doesn't have a Facebook in the middle that controls them, they should also be thinking about how the users of that network have a right to certain privacy expectations and that the software, because now it's software that's intermediating their interactions with other people rather than a person, how the software honors their expectations about privacy. A person who's just wishing someone a happy birthday should feel like a person 100 years ago who went to that person's house, knocked on their door, got let in because the person recognized them, and then they said happy birthday. Not, I'm going to stand on my rooftop and shout happy birthday to Nathan, and Nathan's going to say, thank you for wishing me a happy birthday. Now everyone knows I'm 45 years old, and I didn't want people to know that, right? I don't know. Maybe you're younger, Nathan. Maybe, I don't know.
Look, I mean, the conversation about privacy, it's a conversation that we're having all the time here at Starkware. I mean, Peter, you know Eli Ben-Sasson, the CEO of Starkware, very well.
Mm-hmm.
And he, the technology that he developed, we talk about zero knowledge proofs. It's a whole area of technology that can actually pave the way for a greater level of privacy. I mean, listeners who haven't heard should find the episode with Eli. ZK proofs are absolutely mind-boggling. And do you see that kind of zero knowledge stock technology is potentially taking us to a place of more privacy where we can have our cake and eat it too on blockchain?
I think absolutely. And Eli Ben-Sasson was so far ahead of his time when he was researching zero knowledge proofs, because a lot of that predated crypto and cryptocurrencies writ large. It was sort of an amazing academic mathematical solution to a problem that a lot of people hadn't even asked yet, And what's been amazing about watching Eli build Starkware and work in other projects in the space, some of his early research went into Zcash, which was one of the more privacy-protecting alternatives to Bitcoin in the early days, is that finally there is sort of very real felt need for those previously academic, I think Eli sometimes says moon math scientific research. And to make it a bit more tangible, although you should definitely listen to Eli's direct explanation of zero knowledge proofs, the idea is something we should all definitely want. It's that I should be able to prove to you, Nathan, some fact about my online life. Like I have gotten a driver's license from my local DMV, and they attest that I'm qualified to operate a motor vehicle. But I should be able to show you something on the internet that proves that I have that credential without leaking to you otherwise unnecessary information. Like, I don't mind you knowing my address, Nathan, but there'd be people who I might want to prove that I can drive a car who shouldn't know my home address because I worry about my personal privacy. And a zero knowledge proof allows you to create a verifiable packet of data that says, yes, the person who sent you this packet of data has been given a driving test and has passed that test according to this other entity that is identified on the internet, the DMV. And you can rely on that statement mathematically without me having to hand you a full photocopy of my driver's license that includes my home address and other things. And this is so fundamentally important to the future because, as we know, you can now go on the dark web and find your driver's license, like a photo of it, and buy it from a Russian data broker who's hacked into a server and gotten from a bank probably all of their driver's license photos from all of their customers. And so as we build the systems for the next 10, 20, 30 years, we have to build them with zero knowledge built in. Because if we continue this current regime where we just hand over scanned copies of our passports and our driver's license, identity will become useless because we'll never know if we're dealing with a real person or a bot who just purchased Peter Van Valkenburgh's driver's license on a dark market.
Listeners who are listening to this, who are still confused by the phrase zero knowledge, all this kind of thing, don't worry. We're going to be doing more episodes that delve into this and explain and discuss why this is going to be such an important technology. There's so much more that I would love to ask you, and we will have you back for another conversation soon. Just before you go, give us a little glimpse behind the curtain and give us a sense of one interaction that you've had in government or with an official that has shown either curiosity or cluelessness to blockchain, or something that's a little inspiring or a little bit funny. Just your favorite incident from your life.
I think the most inspiring briefing I've had lately with a politician has been with Representative Tom Emmer in the U.S. House of Representatives. Tom Emmer's, I don't want to be mean, he's an older gentleman, and he's sort of old school. He's not interested in crypto because it's high tech, because it's AI and it's going to be like robot future or something like that. He's interested in it because, as it's been explained to him by us and by others, he feels like it merges with his core values. He believes that, an American should be able to take a $20 bill out of their wallet and buy a lunch without there being a giant corporate bank in between. And so it's kind of interesting that vision of the past, a world where you would just be able to use money to interact one-on-one with another person in a very honest human way, is also a vision of the future. If the future is built on cryptocurrencies and decentralized ledgers and not built on the massive server architecture that we see at banks and big tech companies. And so, we first started talking with Mr. Emmer's office years ago. It wasn't hard to convince him that this technology was something worth protecting because he immediately understood the basic value proposition. And, we need to live up to that. We need to say, yes, we're going to rebuild the good aspects of the past where you could just deal one-on-one with another person. And that's what this technology is good for.
I love that sense that it's not a generation thing. The older generation, we just don't often realize it can be just as engaged. I know it was years after I started working in crypto that my 86-year-old father said, oh, yes, a currency for the whole world. When I was learning Esperanto back in the 50s, that's exactly what we created. And they had a world currency then, which we'll talk about on another occasion. What a delight speaking to Peter. If you would like to follow him on Twitter, it's at Valkenburgh. You may need to Google it because it's not an easy name to spell, but it's at Valkenburgh. He's from Coin Center, so I'm sure you'll be able to find his details. Now, before we finish up today's show, I should tell you that, of course, Gareth has not been with us today. One of his children was unwell and he had to shoot off at the last minute. But he is going to be back for all the future episodes. And also, if you can't wait for the next episode of the Clear Crypto podcast to see Gareth, you can actually catch him daily on his Twitter Spaces with Cointelegraph. Just go on the X of Cointelegraph. You'll see all the details there. That's called Chain Reaction, and it's a great listen every single day. Also, to let you know that if you're not up to date with all the past episodes of the Clear Crypto podcast, it's well worth going back, listening to them, catching up, and recommending them to friends, colleagues, and relatives. This has been the Clear Crypto podcast, brought to you by Starkware and Cointelegraph. produced by our very good friends at Tonal Media. Until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and continue to explore this amazing world that we're building over here in crypto.